December 15th, 1900. 10 days before Christmas, a ship carrying John Adrian Lewis Hope, 7th Earl of Hopetoun, arrives in Sydney. It has been 5 years since the 40-year-old Scottish aristocrat last visited this far-flung corner of the British Empire. When Lord Hopetoun left in 1895, the Australian continent had been a collection of self-governing British colonies. He returns to a nation. After a decade of contentious deliberations and false starts, the 6 Australian colonies, New South Wales, Victoria, Queensland, South Australia, Western Australia and Tasmania, have finally federated. Lord Hopetoun has been afforded the unique honour of serving as this nation's inaugural Governor-General. In this role he will be Australia's head of state, empowered to act on behalf of Her Majesty Queen Victoria. The immediate task facing Lord Hopetoun is to commission an interim government that will hold office until the first federal election due in March 1901. He is not a novice in either political or diplomatic affairs, having served previously as the Conservative whip in the British House of Lords and as Governor of the colony of Victoria. However, his absence has left him largely uninformed about Australia's current political dynamics and the personalities and issues that drove the Federation movement. He is also in poor health, having caught typhoid fever and dysentery during the journey from London. Lord Hopetoun disembarks to a lavish reception. Some of New South Wales' most esteemed politicians are here to welcome him, including the colony's Premier, Sir William Lyne. Lyne introduces Hopetoun to his cabinet and then to 2 other prominent individuals. Edmund Barton, leader of the Federation movement and one of the drafters of the Australian Constitution, and George Reid, Lyne's predecessor as Premier. The main Australian papers are full of praise for the new Governor-General, the Argus describing his arrival as the first jubilant stir of the imminent Commonwealth. Hopetoun remains popular with the upper echelons of Australian society thanks to his time as Governor of Victoria, where the young statesman had a reputation for hosting extravagant events and for carrying out the duties of his office with energy and enthusiasm. But Hopetoun's legacy as Governor-General is destined to be a rather different one. While still recovering from his illness, he has less than 2 weeks to decide who is the most appropriate choice to lead this new government. There is a precedent of sorts. 34 years ago, when the Canadian colonies federated in 1866, the honour went to the Premier of Canada's most populous colony. With New South Wales being both Australia's oldest and largest colony, following that precedent would mean Sir William Lyne becomes Prime Minister. A progressive Liberal notorious for his opposition to the idea of federation, Lyne's protectionist ministry has governed New South Wales for the last year and a half with the support of the Labour Party. The decision has officially been left to Hopetoun's own discretion, but the British Colonial Office privately expects that he will appoint another of the men present that day, Edmund Barton. Unlike Lyne, Barton has never led a government and does not currently hold any political office. However, he is the public face of the Federation movement and one of the key figures in ensuring the Union's success, and is increasingly spoken of in both the media and political circles as the natural choice for Australia's first Prime Minister. It's possible that Hopetoun expects this appointment to be little more than a formality. Whoever gets the top job will only govern for a few months, at which point the people will either endorse his choice or elect a different government. If that is his assumption, it will soon be proven wrong. With both contenders being among New South Wales' most well-known politicians, the question of Australia's first Prime Minister is to become a continuation of the bitter rivalries and rancour that have characterised the colony's politics, and Hopetoun's decision will kick off a political storm that will permanently define his place in history. Lord Hopetoun faces a choice between 2 very different men whose political careers have nonetheless progressed along similar trajectories. Sir William Lyne and Edmund Barton are both veterans of the New South Wales Colonial Parliament, an unruly and unforgiving legislature called the Bear Pit of Macquarie Street. They both entered politics at around the same time, are both roughly aligned with the principles of liberalism and protectionism, have both served as ministers in many of the same cabinets and as allies during their stints in opposition, and now are both leading figures in the colony's protectionist party. William John Lyne was born on April 6, 1844, in Great Swanport in Van Diemen's Land, a colony now called Tasmania. 5 years later, on January 18, 1849, Edmund Barton was born in the Sydney suburb of Glebe. Both men had comfortable upbringings and received good educations, Lyne boarding at Western College and then being privately tutored, while Barton attended the prestigious Sydney Grammar. When he was 20, Lyne and his cousin took up management of a sheep station in North Queensland. He returned to Tasmania a year later and joined the public service as an articled clerk. During this time, Barton was studying at the University of Sydney, where he graduated with a Master's in Arts in 1870 and then pursued a career at the bar. After 10 years in the public service, Lyne moved to New South Wales in 1875 to run a sheep station near Albury, where he also became increasingly involved in community affairs. Barton, meanwhile, found success as a barrister. In a by-election for the seat of the University of Sydney held in 1879, Barton won election to the Legislative Assembly, the lower house of the New South Wales Parliament. At the general election the next year, Lyne was elected to the rural seat of Hume. Both men entered Parliament as supporters of the free trade policies advocated by long-serving Premier Sir Henry Parkes and his allies. Lyne was passionate about irrigation as well as reforming the colony's oft-criticised land laws, while Barton's early parliamentary contributions included advocacy for a free, compulsory and secular education system and opposition to the death penalty in most circumstances. In 1882, Barton was elevated to the speakership. At 33 years old, he was the youngest speaker to have served in any Australian legislature. Lyne and Barton's parliamentary careers coincided with a dramatic realignment in New South Wales colonial politics brought upon by the issue of protective tariffs, taxes levied on imported goods for the purposes of raising revenue and giving local producers and manufacturers an advantage over foreign competitors. What became known as the fiscal question dominated the public debate to the extent that the loose alliances of liberals and conservatives that had previously competed for control of the colony gave way to a vestigial two-party system of protectionists versus free traders. Protectionists believed that tariffs were necessary for the survival of Australia's domestic industries and allowed government spending to be funded without introducing other forms of taxation, while the free traders argued that tariffs restricted competition and raised the price of goods and services and wanted to instead raise revenue through some form of land or income tax. Both Lyne and Barton's political leanings drifted from the ideals of free trade towards protectionism, with Lyne becoming a particularly firm advocate for bolstering the colony's industries through protective tariffs. He became Secretary for Public Works in 1885, serving in the short-lived ministries of Premiers George Dibbs and Patrick Jennings. George Dibbs became Premier again in 1889, now under the banner of the newly formed Protectionist Party, and this time Lyne and Barton would serve in his cabinet, Lyne as Secretary for Lands and Barton as Attorney General. The 1892 Broken Hill miners' strike took place while Barton was Attorney General and acting Premier. While he resisted sending in the military, he did order 50 policemen to the mines to break the strike, which resulted in the ringleaders being arrested and jailed. This earned him the ire of the trade union movement, which was now beginning to organize politically as the Labour Party. It was around this time that several influential colonial figures, among them Sir Henry Parkes, began advocating for the federation of the Australian colonies into a single Commonwealth nation. They argued that such a union would allow for the creation of a national army, standardized policies on matters such as tariffs, immigration and the railways, and would foster a sense of national identity in a time of often extreme parochial rivalries. Barton was an early supporter of federation, coining the memorable catchcry, "A nation for a continent and a continent for a nation." He soon became one of the most prominent politicians associated with the movement. Barton had developed a reputation as a well-spoken and likable politician with a talent for negotiating compromises and forming alliances across the political spectrum, and his rhetoric and dogged campaigning was considered to have won many ordinary Australians over to the cause of federation. However, some also accused him of laziness, gluttony, and a fondness for the bottle, while his perpetual financial troubles caused him embarrassment. Controversial journalist John Norton, owner of the Sydney newspaper Truth and later a Member of Parliament, became notorious for his attacks on the man who he called Bunkum Barton and Tosspot Toby. He characterized Barton as being lazy and a laggard in public and private affairs, and a man who can drink like a fish and eat like a hog and owe money how he likes, to whom he likes, and as long as he likes. Barton's opponents weren't the only colleagues to level such criticisms. When illness forced him to miss crucial parliamentary sittings in 1893, then Premier George Dibbs stated that his Attorney General dearly loves his knife and fork, and the liquids which a good dinner supplies, with the result neglect of business and utter physical collapse, and worried that Barton's habits would lead to his early death. Historian Geoffrey Bolton suggests that Barton used food and drink to cope in times of extreme stress, a theory backed up by Barton's grandson, Dr. David Barton. In a 1999 interview conducted for Bolton's biography of Edmund Barton, the one man for the job, Dr. Barton concluded that his grandfather had bipolar disorder, stating that Edmund's flight from one extravagant house to another at times when he could ill afford it is typical. So is his capacity to work at ferocious pace with little rest in spasms and appear lazy and indolent at other times. Bolton writes that when troubles were heavy, he sought the consolations of the table too unwisely, and from these occasions the legend of Tosspot Toby has grown. A conflict of interest scandal forced Barton to resign his seat in 1893, and after a failed attempt to return to Parliament in 1894, he devoted himself full-time to the campaign for federation. William Lyne remained in the Assembly and continued on as a minister in the Dibbs government, becoming Secretary for Public Works again in 1891, and then Leader of the Opposition when the Protectionists lost office in 1894. Called Big Bill Lyne on account of his imposing height and physique, he was a skilled grassroots politician who was said to personally know almost every voter in his large rural electorate. Radical and parochial in his politics, Lyne had a reputation for straight-talking, stubbornness, and a short temper, his style compared by historian W.G. McMinn to a bull in a china shop. In contrast to Barton, he was a skeptic on federation. Adamant that the proposed federal model wasn't in New South Wales' interests, he became a vocal opponent of the Union as the debate picked up pace. Contemporary opponents such as the Victorian Federalist Alfred Deakin branded Lyne an ignorant and unread wrecker. However, that characterization is disputed by historian Norman Abjorensen, who argues that there is ample evidence of Lyne's intellect and of his willingness to compromise on matters such as federation. Abjorensen calls Lyne's historical legacy a striking testimony to Deakin's influence, which disregards the existence of alternative narratives within the federation process. At the constitutional conventions held on the matter between 1897 and 1898, Barton contributed to the drafting of the federal constitution and played a significant role in ensuring its passage among the convention's delegates. He was now highly regarded by most key federalists and considered the unofficial leader of the federation movement. Lyne also attended the conventions, where he was deeply critical of the draft constitution, describing it as undemocratic. In particular, he was against the proposed upper house, the Senate, which would give each colony an equal number of senators regardless of the colony's population. This meant that New South Wales, which was Australia's most populous colony, would be underrepresented in the future Commonwealth's upper house. Other key figures from New South Wales shared Lyne's concerns, including then Premier George Reid. New South Wales held two referendums on the federation question, the first in 1898 narrowly failing and the second in 1899 succeeding. Barton and Lyne both campaigned heavily during these referendums, Barton for the yes side and Lyne for the no side. In 1898, Barton was re-elected to the Legislative Assembly for the seat of Hastings and Macleay. Lyne had been leader of the opposition for 4 years now and was struggling to get the better of Premier George Reid. It was thought by Lyne's colleagues that Barton would prove a more popular alternative premier, and they convinced him to vacate the opposition leadership in Barton's favour. However, Barton proved ill-suited to the role and remained preoccupied with the campaign for federation. In 1899 he stepped down, and Lyne once again took up the leadership. At the time, the Labour Party held the balance of power in the New South Wales Parliament, where they had been supporting Reid's free trade government. They had now fallen out with Reid, but were unwilling to make Barton Premier on account of his perceived conservatism and his actions during the Broken Hill strike. Lyne, who was more progressive than Barton and supported much of Labour's agenda, was soon able to win their support and oust Reid. Lyne's minority government passed a number of then radical reforms, including the introduction of aged pensions, shorter working days, and regulating the mining industry to ensure safer and fairer working conditions. With the referendum passed, he also attempted to moderate his stance on federation. Barton, again a private citizen, continued campaigning, travelling to the colonies that were still to go to the polls and arguing for a yes vote. In March 1900, Barton led a delegation to London to negotiate the details of the establishment of the new Australian Commonwealth. A particular point of dispute was the role that the Privy Council, the highest court in the United Kingdom, would play in the new nation. The British government was insistent that the Privy Council remain Australia's final court of appeal, and Barton pushed for the yet-to-be-established High Court of Australia to instead hold that honour. The negotiations resulted in a compromise whereby cases could only go to the Privy Council if permitted by Australia's High Court. British Colonial Secretary Joseph Chamberlain and his colleagues were impressed with how Barton conducted himself during these often intense deliberations, and privately indicated to him that they expected he would become Australia's first Prime Minister. Barton and his party returned to Australia in July of that year. While they were en route, Western Australia, the only colony yet to vote on federation, finally went to the polls. The result was a landslide victory for yes. Federation was now a reality. Soon after arriving in Sydney, with only 2 weeks until the new government is to be sworn in, Lord Hopetoun consults with several local statesmen on the task ahead of him. One of these is Lyne's predecessor, George Reid. Reid served as Premier of New South Wales for 5 consecutive years, from 1984 to 1989, a significant tenure in an era of unstable parliaments and frequent changes of government. For some time he had been considered a likely choice for the prime ministership, a view he was happy to encourage. But his perceived vacillation on the topic of federation has made him enemies on both sides of the debate, and he is no longer considered a realistic option since losing office. Reid advises Hopetoun to appoint Lyne. According to Geoffrey Bolton, Reid genuinely believed that the Premier of the senior colony was entitled to the honour, and he also thought that Barton was too friendly with the Victorians to look after New South Wales' interests adequately. Privately, Reid also calculated that Lyne would not be able to form such a strong ministry as Barton, and might more easily be defeated by an experienced opposition leader such as himself. Hopetoun also speaks with the Chief Justice of New South Wales, Sir Frederick Darley, who is presently also serving as the colony's acting governor. What is said during the meeting with Darley is unknown, but the Chief Justice has a notably poor opinion of Barton. In a letter sent to fellow jurist Sir Samuel Way around the same time, Darley writes that Barton does not command respect here. He is undoubtedly an able man and might have been a distinguished man at the bar, but he is too lazy to work and has therefore but little experience. Hopetoun and Barton do not meet again during this time. Barton is reluctant to openly put his hand up and does not wish to impose on an ill man, while Hopetoun does not call on him. On the 19th of December, Hopetoun commissions Sir William Lyne to form a ministry, on the condition that it contains, in Hopetoun's words, nothing but first-class men from each of the colonies. Lyne accepts. It is a logical and orthodox choice in many respects. Lyne has experience leading an administration, and his appointment is in line with precedent, whereas Barton is presently a private citizen with a rather less impressive record in elected office. But Hopetoun has failed to take into account 2 things. The first is Lyne's own opposition towards federation. Not only did he advocate a no vote in both referendums, but he then alleged electoral fraud when the second succeeded. This has left him incredibly unpopular with the pro-federation side of politics, which includes many of his fellow protectionists. The second is that many of this new nation's dominant political figures, including most incumbent colonial premiers, both expect and want Barton to be appointed Prime Minister, and have already begun jostling for positions in his federal cabinet in various clandestine meetings. The appointment is met with shock by many. The Sydney Morning Herald calls it a complete surprise and argues that Barton had the superior claim, while conservative Melbourne paper The Argus describes the decision as a deep disappointment, saying that Hopetoun has fulfilled neither the expectation nor the wish of the vast majority of true Federalists. The Brisbane Courier expresses similar sentiments, arguing that there are half a dozen representative Australians in the other colonies whose claim to the selection was greater and whose appointment would have been more satisfactory, and that it is doubtful that Lyne will succeed in forming a strong ministry. The Bulletin describes Lyne as the dullest and most ordinary of Australia's highest-ranking politicians, and in a famous cartoon depicts him as having stolen the premiership from its rightful owner, Barton. In what is likely a particularly concerning development for the Governor-General, he receives a telegram from the formidable Joseph Chamberlain of the British Colonial Office, who demands an explanation as to why Barton wasn't commissioned instead. Edmund Barton's supporters are especially shocked and outraged by the appointment. Former South Australian Premier Sir John Downer, an ardent Federalist, refuses to believe the news, telling reporters, "Until I have verified it myself, I shall continue to regard it as utterly incredible." In a flurry of letters and telegrams, Barton's allies begin lobbying statesmen across the nation, trying to convince them not to serve in Lyne's government. Lyne's commission is dependent on him being able to assemble a respectable ministry, and the Barton camp hopes that if he is unable to court enough politicians who meet that description, he will be forced to resign. Leading the charge is Alfred Deakin, a popular Victorian MP and a key Barton ally who is one of Victoria's most prominent Federalists. Despite holding similar views to Lyne on protectionism, Deakin has disliked and distrusted the New South Wales Premier ever since he came out against Federation, describing him as slow-witted, clumsy of speech and figure, suspicious to the last degree and parochial in every conception. In a letter to Barton soon after hearing the news, Deakin writes, "Who could have believed that Hopetoun would make such a blunder? It passes all comprehension and must be a great disappointment to you." Unperturbed, Lyne gets to work trying to put together a ministry. The day after his appointment, he meets Barton and offers him a position. Barton refuses, citing Lyne's opposition to the very federal system that he now wishes to lead. Lyne also calls on the premiers of each colony to make them similar offers, but most either refuse or are ambivalent, with only Victorian Premier George Turner and South Australian Premier Frederick Holder agreeing to meet with him for further discussion. Alfred Deakin, who is an ally of Turner's and served under him in the Victorian Parliament, is hopeful his former leader can persuade Lyne to resign in Barton's favour, but Turner is unsuccessful. Lyne is determined to be Prime Minister. He is not without support in the media or the political class. Predictably, John Norton writes in favour of the decision. In open letters to Lyne and Hopetoun published in his paper Truth, he repeats his usual attacks on Barton's character and claims he belongs to a brood of briefless lawyers, political parasites and putrid pressmen who he warns will sell out New South Wales. He begs Hopetoun to stand his ground and not give in to the demands of Barton's supporters. More surprisingly, The Age, a Melbourne-based newspaper known for its support of Victorian Liberals such as Deakin and Turner, also endorses Lyne's appointment. In an editorial, it states that the choice, though not generally anticipated, will not be widely disapproved of, and points out that Lyne boasts greater executive experience than Barton. This endorsement has come about as the result of private negotiations between Lyne and The Age's editor David Syme. Like Lyne, Syme is a fierce advocate for protectionism. He is persuaded to have his paper support Lyne after the latter promises that he will introduce a federal tariff that is at least as high as the one currently in place in Victoria. The South Australian Register opines that Lord Hopetoun has carried to its logical conclusion the arrangement by which the Premier of the mother colony is always treated as the federal leader, and urges fairness from those disappointed by the decision. Former Victorian Premier Alan McLean says that he had always assumed the job would go to Lyne, while incumbent Queensland Premier Robert Philp claims both Lyne or Barton would have made sense as a choice, and that Hopetoun had probably done the right thing in selecting the Premier of the mother colony. George Reid argues that Hopetoun has taken the only course open to him, and says that he would have been rightly aggrieved if Hopetoun had commissioned Barton. In a letter to Barton on the 21st of December, a despondent Deakin fears that their allies will eventually give in and accept Lyne's invitations to join his government, and suggests that only former South Australian Premier Charles Kingston can be relied upon to stand firm against his appointment. He writes, The whole business makes me sick with disgust. Deakin begins lobbying David Syme, with whom he boasts a long-standing relationship, to reverse the Age's endorsement of Lyne. If Lyne cannot be convinced to step down, Barton, Deakin and their allies may have no choice but to accept positions in his ministry. Despite the bad blood over federation, they are still protectionists, and there is increasing concern that if they boycott Lyne's government, their disunity will help George Reid's Free Trade Party win the upcoming election. Even Deakin suggests that Barton should reconsider his refusal to serve under Lyne in the event that the latter cannot be prevented from becoming Prime Minister, writing, "You can command your own terms. You being joint head and controlling all the selection of colleagues, you would then have the reality of power and he the shadow." For Barton, becoming Prime Minister doesn't just mean the fulfillment of his political ambitions. Infamously poor with money even in better times, he no longer receives a parliamentary salary and has had little time to practice law while campaigning. He lived off of an allowance from the New South Wales government while spruiking the cause of federation, and his personal finances are in a dire state. In an interview with Geoffrey Bolton nearly a century later in 1995, Barton's daughter-in-law, Marjorie Barton, said they had little in the larder by the end of the year, and it looked as though they would be facing a grim Christmas. A prime ministerial salary would substantially ease such woes. By the 22nd of December, George Turner has decided he will not serve under Lyne. He is unwilling to be part of any ministry that does not include Deakin and Barton, and tells the press that he saw nothing ahead but strife and trouble if Lyne succeeded in forming a ministry which did not include some of the leading Federalists. After further persuasion from Deakin, Holder makes the same decision. Turner and Deakin's absence from the ministry convinces David Syme to shift the Age's allegiance to Barton, his ambivalent support of Lyne being contingent on at least one of those two powerful Victorians being in Lyne's ministry. Lyne's desperate offer to appoint two other Victorians of Syme's choice to his cabinet isn't enough to change his mind. Despite the setbacks, Lyne continues his dogged efforts to form a government. While none of the incumbent premiers and few former premiers have accepted his invites to the ministry, his hopes are buoyed by the fact that few have refused either. In a last-ditch effort, he attempts to entice the highly respected statesman and jurist Sir Samuel Griffith into his team with an offer of both the Attorney Generalship and a future appointment as Chief Justice of the High Court of Australia. Griffith, who had previously served as Premier and Chief Justice of Queensland, is a committed federalist responsible for drafting much of the Australian Constitution. Like his colleagues, he also neglects to give a straight answer to Lyne's invitation. By Christmas Eve, it's clear that Lyne will be unable to form a ministry of the calibre that Lord Hopetoun expects. He accepts the inevitable and tenders his resignation to the Governor-General, advising that Barton be called for instead. Hopetoun appoints Barton to the Prime Ministership that same night. Barton then sends a telegram to Deakin containing a single word, "Come," the agreed-upon signal for the latter to join him in Sydney. Soon afterwards, Lyne speaks to reporters, explaining his reasons for returning his commission and wishing Barton every success as Prime Minister. In its account of the press conference, the Argus says that Lyne took his defeat with a good grace, and that when he is beaten, he accepts the fact and does not exhibit either anger or grief. According to Norman Abjorensen, just how close Lyne came to forming a ministry is difficult to gauge. Despite the initial surprise at Hopetoun's call, press comment generally assumed that he would succeed, although the shape and strength of his probable team was open to question. Lyne was reported as satisfied with responses to his first telegrams to the various premiers who had replied in a more or less friendly way. Yet, up to the time of resigning his commission, not a single person had positively agreed to join him. Lyne himself claims that the only troubles he had in putting together his government came from Victoria and Western Australia, telling reporters, "All the gentlemen I asked in the other colonies were willing to join." With the interim government scheduled to be inaugurated in 7 days, Edmund Barton meets with Alfred Deakin to finalise the composition of his ministry. This is something they have been working on for some time. Before Hopetoun had even arrived in Australia, Barton, Deakin and their allies were engaged in secretive discussions about just who would be part of this inaugural government. Their main considerations are to ensure that the ministry is made up of a diverse mix of high-ranking and respected politicians to whom they are politically aligned, with each colony fairly represented. Dubbed the Cabinet of Kings, this ministry contains some of the most notable politicians of the time, including 6 current or former colonial premiers. Among them is Sir William Lyne, made Minister for Home Affairs in the new administration as a consolation prize for giving up the top job. Alfred Deakin is to be the Attorney General, George Turner the Treasurer, and Charles Kingston will be Minister for Trade and Customs, while incumbent Western Australian Premier John Forrest will serve as the Postmaster General and former Queensland Premier James Dixon as Minister for Defence. Rounding out the cabinet are incumbent Tasmanian Premier Elliot Lewis, serving as Minister without portfolio, and the prominent Federalist and New South Wales MP Richard O'Connor as Vice President of the Executive Council. Not everybody is pleased with the arrangement. Deakin's insistence on Charles Kingston being included in the ministry means fellow South Australian Frederick Holder misses out. He's upset by the snub, and Barton attempts to placate him by promising him the speakership in the yet-to-be-elected federal parliament. Sir Samuel Griffith is also angry about being excluded. He says little publicly, but in a diary entry written upon hearing the news, calls Barton a fathead and fellow Queenslander James Dixon a prating cockatoo. The papers generally approve of Barton's ministry, praising its talent and experience, while also expressing mild concern about how the new Prime Minister will go about managing so many forceful personalities that are used to being in charge. While this strange political crisis is now over, the damage to Lord Hopetoun's reputation has been done. The Governor-General's perceived failure to consult widely and his lack of consideration for local politics receives much of the blame from both the media and future historians for what transpired. Previously considered a popular and effective statesman, Hopetoun's legacy shall instead be defined by Deakin's turn of phrase. The events that occurred in the 10 days before Christmas 1900 are to be forever remembered as the Hopetoun Blunder, a cautionary tale of vice-regal arrogance and ignorance. As for Barton, while he has won the first battle, there is still an election to come. The interim appointment gives Barton and his government the advantages of incumbency without the drawbacks of having had to make unpopular decisions, and as such they are regarded as the favourites in the upcoming poll. But it is far from guaranteed that he will still be Prime Minister once the returns are in. Barton's protectionists face 2 formidable opponents in the March election. One is the Free Trade Party. Led by Barton and Lyne's old adversary George Reid, the protectionists' ascension to government means the free traders are now considered the unofficial opposition. The second is the Labour Party, the political wing of the trade union movement, a new third force in Australian politics which is increasingly dominating the working class vote.